From the windows of India's brand new embassy in Budapest, the paint on the walls still not dry, the young diplomat Mohammad Ataur Rahman watched a tiny nation rise up against an empire. Tens of thousands of protesters gathered as the intellectual Peter Verej read out a manifesto demanding independence from foreign powers and democracy. A statue of the Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin was brought down and decapitated. Communist emblems were torn out of the national flag. Then, Rahman watched as the Soviet Union's tanks rolled in. Thousands died in street fighting as the Second World War hero Marshal Georgy Zhukov's soldiers snuffed out the revolution of 1956. Imre Nagy, who became prime minister in the revolution, was later executed after a secret trial. Like in 1956, New Delhi has responded to the crisis in Ukraine with pious but anodyne words. All sides, de-escalation, diplomatic engagement, stepped-up democracy, none of which really means very much. For generations, India's grand strategy for dealing with great power conflicts has consisted of sitting on the fence. But this time around, the country might find that sitting on the fence is dangerous because you can end up impaling yourself on one of the spikes. The salvos of sanctions the United States and its allies are firing against Russia is the stuff of Indian nightmares. The United States is yet to grant a waiver exempting India from sanctions against purchasing Russian military equipment. Getting Washington to now sign off on the purchase of the S-400 air defense system seems pretty much impossible. There's no clarity on how India will be able to continue defense imports from Russia, which are so critical for our military preparedness. From the 1950s, spurned by the West, India had slowly turned to the Soviet Union for military equipment and technology. Even though imports from Russia have slowly declined in recent years, expert Sameer Lalwani and others have estimated that perhaps 80% of all Indian defense equipment originated in Russia. India was responsible for a third of all Russian defense exports in 2010-2020, and that equipment needs spare parts and service. This even doesn't count the most important part of that relationship, which is that Russia is the only country prepared to share certain kinds of missile and nuclear technology. India's tenacious commitment to equivocation, though, has reached a point of impasse. New Delhi can't break with partners it needs to hedge against China, like the United States, Australia, and Japan. The cost of severing its relationship with Russia, though, obviously isn't trivial. New Delhi's unhappiness with the sanctions which are now unfolding isn't hard to understand, and it's not just about military dependence. From research conducted by experts at Rabobank, one of the big European banks, it's clear that genuinely effective sanctions on Russia will also have a harsh impact on India. Russia is one of the three largest suppliers of crude oil, along with the United States and Saudi Arabia. India buys hardly any Russian crude, but if other producers like Saudi Arabia don't compensate for Russian supplies knocked out of the global market by sanctions, prices could surge up. Inside hours of the Russian invasion, prices crossed $100 for the first time in 7 years. They've fallen again because the West hasn't yet imposed energy sanctions because of European concerns, but that may not be the end of the story. The last significant disruption in oil supplies, which was caused by the Libyan civil war in 2011, kept crude oil above $125 for months. The rising tide of inflation hurt regimes worldwide, including, of course, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh's government. Trade between India and Russia is small, just about 1.6% of all imports in 2020 and about 1.3% of all exports. But there will be other impacts. Russia is a significant source of grains, fertilizer, and metal. The country provides about half the world's nickel and palladium, which is used for everything from kitchen sinks to mobile phones, as well as a quarter of the world's aluminium. Earlier US sanctions on Russian aluminium, interestingly, had to be rapidly dropped after it became clear that they'd sent car-making costs through the roof. Even harder to assess is what the impacts might be on India if the West introduces secondary sanctions on banks and corporations in China that trade with Russia, defying the sanctions. Like other leaders, Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru was appalled by the Soviet invasion. The events in Hungary, an Indian memorandum handed to Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko stated, have shattered the beliefs of millions of people who had begun to view the USSR as a beacon of hope. Along with the leaders of Sri Lanka, Myanmar and Indonesia, Prime Minister Nehru demanded that Soviet forces be withdrawn and Hungary's people allowed to choose their own government. The question then, as now, was, if India didn't stand up for less powerful countries being bullied by superpowers, of what worth were its assertions of anti-imperialism and non-alignment? In the United Nations, though, India refused to vote for a US-sponsored resolution condemning the Soviet invasion and calling for the withdrawal of its troops. New Delhi even opposed the inscription of the Hungarian crisis on the agenda of plenary sessions of the General Assembly. Later, India quietly accepted the Soviet invasion of another defiant republic, Czechoslovakia. To the irritation of his bosses in Delhi and to his great personal credit, the young diplomat in Budapest, Rahman, lobbied hard for humane treatment of Hungarian dissidents, including Arpad Goncs, who went on to be elected president of Hungary in 1990. He even used his own car to smuggle out a dissident who had liaised between the embassy and Imre Nagy's brief-lived government. For New Delhi, though, the issue wasn't about honor and morals. India suspected that Pakistan was planning to raise the Kashmir issue in the United Nations. New Delhi would then need the Soviet Union to veto any hostile resolutions, since it had no other friends on the Security Council. Like now, there was also the issue of arms, which Soviet Union had just started providing. There was the need for Russia as a counterweight to China. And there was frustration at great power double standards. France and the United Kingdom, after all, had invaded Egypt just the previous year. Every leader since Nehru has found equivocation to be of utility. Even though Prime Minister Narendra Modi has often condemned Prime Minister Nehru's purportedly weak-kneed foreign policy, his own language on Russia hasn't been significantly different from that we saw in 1956. Following Russia's seizure of Crimea in 2014, Prime Minister Modi said his effort would be to get the adversaries to sit together and talk and to resolve problems in an ongoing process. Again, a bit like Nehru, Prime Minister Modi has had words of reproach for the hypocrisy of the great powers, reminding some of those criticizing Russia that, I quote, they too have sinned. He's right. After all, the United States invaded Iraq without any great legal legitimacy or morals. The Ukraine crisis is indeed the outcome of many things, among them the United States' dangerous effort to push the frontiers of the North Atlantic Treaty eastwards onto Russia's frontiers. The principle asserted by Vladimir Putin, which is basically that the strong can do what they can and the weak must suffer what they must, as the classical historian Thucydides put it many centuries ago. This principle is, however, profoundly dangerous for India. For its own good, New Delhi simply cannot accept that the future of the world will be shaped by superpowers who will decide what their spheres of influence are and use hard power to enforce their influence. There's no way to tell how hard the sanctions sword will eventually fall or how deep it will cut, but in its own interests, New Delhi must prove itself willing to share the pain and make it clear that the new world order that is being built isn't one it agrees with. I'm Praveen Swami and I'm National Security Editor of ThePrint.